Lorwyn, Chapter 5. With the combined efforts of two giants devoted to the task of utter destruction, boggarts and disturbing bits of boggarts flew around the air with alarming and untidy regularity. Rhys dodged another wrinkled, leathery, screaming lump, slung his bow and drew his sword. This boggart survived the impact, but its back was clearly broken. Rhys dispatched it with a swipe of his sword and moved on, resigned to the grisly, undignified mop-up job this carefully planned ambush had become. Cleaning up after giants was appalling, but it was better than the alternatives, such as some of the boggarts escaping or reaching Kinsbale, or, worst of all, inflicting serious injury on the hunters. But it still wasn't going to look good. Rhys hoped that in the final weighing he would at least get credit for eliminating the dangerous mob of scavengers, even if it had been a sloppy, poorly executed affair. Another boggart ran screaming through the clearing, its left arm a ragged stump. It tripped, and by the time its body struck the ground, the creature no longer had the strength to rise. Rhys finished it off with a disgusted snarl. Fresh blood spattered upon his once glorious hunter's mantle, already saturated with gore. The mantle would, of course, have to be burned and replaced at great personal expense. Another wretched bit of dishonour for any Dane, doubly so for Rhys, currently wearing his third. The dying screamer had only been the forefront of a stinking, panicked mob of his doomed kin. Down the same blood-soaked trail, a new surprisingly intact boggart desperately charged Rhys from the woods, leading a small gang of his still riled kin. Before the creature got within 10 feet of the pack leader, a silver arrow appeared in the center of its chest. The arrow's momentum and a little bit of mass-altering magic carried the shrieking little horror back into its followers, and the lot of them fell into a tangled heap, all but one rasping boggart at the rear. It barreled wildly over its prone friends like a punch-drunk kifkin and leaped at Rhys's throat, trailing blood from an open chest wound that had more than likely collapsed one lung, judging from the choking sounds that interrupted its gasping cries of fury. A second arrow just cleared the pack leader's shoulder and struck deep into the howling boggart's neck, immediately freeing the boggart of the need to draw breath ever again. Rhys quickly set upon the stunned survivors of the boggart's desperate charge with his sword and dagger. They were little trouble, though a burly female in unusual robes, unusual for a boggart at least, attempted some boggart swamp magic. The burgeoning red glow in the female's eyes was easily doused with a swipe of a blade, and with that, anything resembling a boggart counterattack was over. This victory filled Rhys with disgust, with himself, with his situation and his hunters. It was briefly almost overwhelming, but a moment later his training reasserted itself and demanded the discipline in the pack be maintained. Rhys knew exactly who had fired those wasteful and inelegant shots into the boggart mob, and he whirled upon the pair of elves approaching from the south. These two were newcomers to Rhys's pack. Each wore expressions of relief that Rhys was safe, mixed with lingering pleasure and pride over their bloody work, but their faces fell under his sharp, stern glare. "Well?" he spoke calmly, but specifically addressed neither one or the other. "Well what?" parroted Taercenn. The female hunter knocked another arrow and scanned the tree line as she spoke. "We just saved your life, Taer." Her silent male counterpart, Graf, nodded in agreement as he too slipped another arrow into place. "One of you made a shot barely worthy of a Kifkin child, let alone a hunter. Your arrow buried itself in the breastbone and punched it back. You might as well have thrown a rock. Your bolt should have gone straight through its ribcage and through every boggart behind him. And you," Rhys snarled at Gruff, "took a needless chance for the sake of drama. If I had tried to dodge or draw my weapon, if I had moved at all, your arrow would have hit me instead of the target. Unacceptable. Track your target or don't target anything. There can be no cracks in the face of perfection." The pair visibly sulked but held their tongues. Rhys let his glare slip into a scowl, and he spoke with a touch of true menace. "We will speak of this further upon our return. Now get busy. Help the giants finish this mess. Until you master discipline with your bow, this is the only duty for which either of you is fit." He straightened and nodded. Taercenn and Graf did the same, almost simultaneously, though they did not straighten quite as much nor nod quite as sharply. As the two sullen archers went across the clearing towards the sound of the giant's mayhem, another elf emerged from the tree line. He was tall and handsome, a study in elegant elf beauty, and he wore a confident smile. They were not the ones that fired early, and now they're mopping up. An orderly end to a fight like this is unlikely, the new arrival said. At a scowl from the Dane, Griffith saluted stiffly and added, "Taer." He was Rhys's second in command and no fool. He was also a friend, though one who wouldn't have been spared his superior's wrath had he not snapped to attention. "They fired badly in the middle of an ambush gone bad," Rhys replied, "and they smiled at me like I ought to have thanked them for it." Griffith sidled up to him and glanced over the smashed trail of corpses Brion had left in his wake. "Shall I discipline them further, Taer?" "You call that discipline? I barely scolded them." With his eyes down, Griffith said, "Permission to speak freely, Taer." He smiled guiltily. "Rhys?" "Granted," Rhys said with growing irritation. "But Griff, for bog's sake keep it brief. I have a fiasco to clean up, and I'm not—" "That's what I wanted to say, my friend. Bringing giants into this was a mistake. Pulling back the pack to let the giants work was a mistake. Using you poison, big mistake. Nath won't like it." Griffith leaned slightly as another boggart flew past them and landed with a crunch against a tree trunk. "Even if it was effective." "I am a gilt-leaf pack leader," Rhys replied. "Taercenn Nath commands many packs at once, but this one is mine. For as long as I hold my rank and my pack's respect, it is mine." "You are faultless," Griffith agreed, "but Nath is exquisite. Don't delude yourself. He alone commands your sword. The pack may be yours, but it's also his. The mistakes, those are yours, I am afraid." "It is not something I am proud of, but it was necessary," Rhys said. "You know as well as I do that something's gotten into the boggarts of late. I chose to ensure the success of this effort, and I've done what Nath wanted done. What he ordered done." "But not as Nath wanted it done." "Nath was not here," Rhys shook his head angrily, "and he is my superior in the pack, not my master. I had a master for many years, and now I am my own." Griffith scowled. "Your treefolk sage isn't Nath, Rhys. I worry when you talk like this. Every treefolk you cite and giant you hire tells Nath you are not fit for this service. When Nath sees this, when we all see this, we wonder why you hunt with us at all. Why one so privileged and elite deigns to chase boggarts in the blood and mud along lowly soldiers." Rhys glared at his friend. "Are you finished?" "Almost. Someone has to say this, my friend, and I say it plainly. You may not call Nath master, but you are a member of his pack. He has the power of life and death over you. You must follow his orders and honor his intentions." "While following my own initiative," Rhys replied. "Always." "More treefolk blabber," Griffith said dryly. "Even a sage's teachings are subordinate to pack discipline, my Dane." Rhys abruptly turned back to his second. "Is this a friendly warning or a friendly threat?" Griffith dropped his eyes and said nothing. "Thank you for your opinion and your advice, but I will continue to lead my pack my way. Let Nath raise his objections and I will answer them." Rhys dusted off his hands. "Now then, I have order to enforce, discipline to mete out, and perfection to preserve. Unless you feel a need to undermine me further, I would like to get on with it." Griffith straightened his lean body and drove both hoof feet into the earth. "My Dane," he said soberly, and this time he sounded like he meant it. "Very good," Rhys said. "Now, your orders. Pick 3 hunters, take 1 with you. Send the other pair in the opposite direction. You're marching the perimeter of this hunting ground. Any stragglers or survivors the giant missed are to be exterminated. If you see young Yelm, do nothing but send him to me. I will deal with him." Griffith touched 2 fingers to his right horn by way of a salute, turned on 1 hoof, and stalked off to carry out his orders without another word. Rhys allowed a small sigh to crack his stern facade. He and Griffith had been comrades for a long time, and it could just as easily have been Griffith in command of the 4th hunting pack. But the rivalry between the elf nation's military and spiritual factions seemed to have finally trickled its way down into individual hunting packs. Griffith had not been chosen for apprenticeship with a treefolk mentor, and he was becoming increasingly vocal about the need for elf and treefolk to keep their distance. Rhys lamented that Griffith's opinion, whether motivated by resentment, politics, or true concern for the future of their blessed nation, would inevitably ruin their ability to function in the same pack. Griffith's bitterness was unfortunate, but Rhys found that which really troubled him crouched in fear atop a thick knothole branch, 20 feet off the ground and roughly 70 yards to the east of the Dane's initial position in the ambush. The exact location from which that first arrow had flown before the signal was given, triggering the unnecessarily chaotic slaughter. My Dane, Yelm managed. Rhys was slightly impressed from the look of the pale youth's face. It was remarkable Yelm could speak at all. It was a disciplined testament to whatever scant training the young hunter had been able to grab before earning a place within the pack, perhaps, or a hint of the youth's future potential. Right now, neither of those positives were enough to forestall Rhys's boiling anger. "Hunter Yelm," Rhys said, stopping and nodding to the youth. "Come down here." "Yes, Taer," Yelm replied immediately with an appropriate honorific. He leaped from the perch and gracefully reached the carnage-strewn forest floor with a few nimble hops. With another quick step, he stood before Rhys at attention. Only a mild twitch in his fingers and a cocking of a right horn betrayed the young hunter's nervousness, but in a pack hunter it was a glaring sign of fear. "You fired before the signal was given," the Dane said. "Why?" "I heard a sound," Yelm said. "A crack, and I saw movement. I thought I had missed the signal somehow. We had to time things so precisely, Taer, and I wanted to follow your orders as you were given them, and so I fired." Honest, to the point, and a touch defensive, young Yelm was a natural. Again, Rhys felt his anger tempered by a sense of pride in his subordinate who, though clearly anxious, did not try to dance around his own culpability. But this didn't temper his anger much. "And because you fired," Rhys said with a forced calm, "we went from an organized extermination to this. Dane Rhys of the 4th Gilt-Leaf Pack," bellowed a strong, sharp voice. It was the last voice Rhys expected or wanted to hear at that moment. The Dane jumped a little bit, an embarrassing loss of composure before a subordinate. Or rather it would have been if the voice of the Gilt-Leaf Supreme Commander, Taercenn Nath, had not caused young Yelm to whimper aloud. "What is the meaning of this?" Taercenn Nath stomped through the boggart-ridden battlefield with his fierce eyes fixed on the Dane. From the sound of it, Taercenn Nath had been watching and listening for some time now. Nath was taller than Rhys, taller than any of the elves Rhys knew, and he wore armor of gleaming mesh woven from rare silverwood bark. His horns were full and magnificent, thick and strong and sharp, and he walked with the authority of one who could order the death of any creature he happened upon with a single word and without regret. "I am executing the duty you assigned, my Taercenn," Rhys replied without making eye contact. "It appears I misunderstood your intent." He had expected criticism for hiring the giants. He even expected to be taken to task for allowing young Yelm to trigger the backup plan. but he never expected Nath to stand before him with real murder in his eyes. "We will discuss your failings in more detail shortly," Nath said, dismissing Rhys's defense with a wave of his hand as he drew his sword with the other. The Taercenn stepped back, raised his weapon, and drove it deep into Yelm's skull between the eyes, killing the youth instantly. Rhys could not stop short of a cough of surprise and objection. Yelm was not of the Hemlock pack, and thus Yelm was Rhys's to kill if he decided killing was necessary. As he saw the spark of life abruptly go out in the young hunter's eyes, Rhys realized he'd already decided it wasn't. Taercenn Nath withdrew his blade. He wiped it clean on Yelm's tunic before the youth's body could topple, and then Nath turned to Rhys. "Taercenn, that was discipline, Hunter," Nath said. "Pack discipline, elf discipline, gilt leaf discipline. You should try it sometime." He jerked his head roughly. "Conclude any business you have with your hired thugs and send them as far away from here as fast as they can go. I do not wish to see them again. After you've done that, return to my camp and wait for me there." Nath drew himself up and his voice boomed. "I am taking charge here. As of this moment, you are formally and officially relieved of command." Brian stood next to a rocky hill up to his calves in a mound of broken boggarts. His brother Kiel sat nearby, his dull features fixed and his eyes unfocused as he absently sifted dirt and stones through his massive fingers. In this relative state of calm, Rhys steeled himself before taking a good look at his hirelings, if such a diminutive-sounding word could be applied to such oversized creatures. They claimed to be brothers, but beyond their enormous size they appeared to have very little in common. Brian was at least 40 feet tall, but he was built broad and round like some great shambling hillock. His head was as bald as an egg, and his crown sloped down to a huge curved brow that cast shadows over his deep-set eyes. Brian's nose was wide and bulbous. His thick lantern jaw was twisted by an underbite that forced a row of tusk-like fangs over his upper lip, like a poorly laid fence. Brian's earlobes were long and drooping, and they wagged every time he moved his head, their ends flapping below his chin. His torso was round and fat as a baby's, but his arms and legs were thick with knotty muscles. He wore a rough stitched shirt made from some greenish animal hide, and he bore a distinctive scar across his throat, where he had told Rhys by way of introduction his brother Kiel had tried to tear it out when the two were no taller than servants. Kiel's height equaled his brother's, but his shape was entirely different. He was broad-shouldered, even more than Brian, but his muscle-swollen upper body tapered down to a narrow waist on top of a stunted pair of legs that seemed better suited to a Kithkin than a giant. Where Brian was almost proportional from head to toe, at least 2/3 of Kiel's body length was his torso. Kiel's long arms hung straight to the ground, and the calluses on the backs of his knuckles had been hardened and polished smooth from the years of being dragged along behind their owner. Kiel's head was long, almost oblong, and it came to a rounded point at both crown and chin. His face was narrow, his features crowded together near its center, and his tiny round ears stood almost perpendicular to his skull. Kiel was bald, but he sported a set of long white chin whiskers that stretched down to the ground. The end of his beard was a tangled mess of dirt, rocks, blood, and tree limbs. Rhys strode up to Brian, who handled all of the negotiations. Brian could string words into sentences fairly reliably, but Kiel had so far not said anything more coherent than a grunt. The elf whistled loudly as he approached, and the 40-foot brute looked down with a sneer. Then he saw Rhys and grinned through a mouthful of crooked, broken teeth. Rhys extended twin coils of gold thread. "The job's done. Here is your payment." Brian peered at the elf's relatively tiny hand. "Not done, boss," the giant said. "Not yet." Rhys spoke as calmly as he could. The job is done, he said again. The proximity of the giant's bloody fists as Brian crouched to one knee to speak to him was concerning, but the giant-sized cloud of halitosis coming from Brian and his silent brother was downright painful. "No boggarts left, boss," Brian said. He scratched the back of his domed skull thoughtfully. "Won't take more than a few days to stomp 'em all out, though." "That won't be necessary. The Guilt Leaf will handle things from here." Brian shook his head. "No good. We had a deal." "And I am honouring it." Rhys extended the thread once more. "Take this and go. I don't have time to argue, and you have to move along now." Brian leaned back and sat, his heavy body sinking into the soil. "If we don't do the work, we don't get the thread. That's the deal." "I am releasing you from the deal." "You can't. Deal's a deal, boss. Make no mistake, and deal's not done. Still more boggarts." "Listen to me." Rhys's voice was cold and level. "I hired you. I'm the boss. I define the... I tell you what to do, you hear me? The boss is telling you to take your money and go. There's no more work for you here." "Can't take the thread if we didn't do the work," the giant objected. "We don't need elf charity. We have pride." "Fine." Rhys tucked the gold thread back into his pack. "Don't take it. You'll still have to move along." "But you owe us. We helped fight the boggarts," Brian said. "And you won't let me pay you for it. How is that my problem?" "Let's forget the money," Brian said. The giant had a thoughtful gleam in his huge eyes that Rhys didn't like at all. "Let's call it a favour we did for you." "A favour? Not a job?" "Right," Rhys said, nodding impatiently. "And in return, instead of money, which we can't take anyway because we didn't do a job, which was really a favour anyway, you can do a favour for us." Rhys blinked and nodded. Sure. That works? Did you have something in mind?" "Message," Kiel said, speaking at last. "In a minute, Kiel," Brion said, and then he replied to the elf. "We like it here. We might be staying in Kinsbale. Good cooks, the Kifkin. Good ale. Good stories. Kiel and I, we do a few jobs, make a thread, hear a few stories. Then we bring 'em home to our sister." "That's all very interesting. You were telling me about the favour you want." "I am telling you, yes. Hush and let me tell." Brian paused, visibly trying to remember where he left off. Then his face brightened. "We collect thread for us and stories for our sister. Her birthday is coming up. We can't keep collecting stories and deliver the stories in time. You make the delivery for us, eh?" "Message," Kiel said again. His huge chest expanded and he exhaled hard. "Kiel has a birthday message for our sister too. You deliver that as part of our new deal, all right?" "I don't deliver messages, my friend," Rhys said. "You get messenger for us. We're busy, you know. You get messenger to bring stories and message our sister." He cleaned his hands on the filthy rag stretched across his chest. "Then we are all even. Favours repaid." "I can arrange to deliver your message," Rhys said slowly, with a growing certainty he had been duped somehow. But not in any way he could yet comprehend. The sensation was unsettling. "But not right away. I have other business." "We just want it done before the big Sky Show," Brian said. "Otherwise we'll miss her birthday, and that would be pretty bad." Brian shivered, and Kiel nodded so vigorously his head swept up a cloud of dust. "Very, very bad," Kiel said. Brian held out a thumb and peeled off a single grimy thread. Rhys saw a speck of gold underneath the patina of filth. Brian gingerly held the thread out and said, "Here, for paying the messenger." Rhys shook his head. Brian shrugged. He squinted one eye and carefully wound the thread back around his finger. "Tails?" said Rhys. "Aye, tails," Brian rumbled with a nod towards his brother. "Kiel wants tails. Tails for our sister. So we'll stay near Kinsbale a while. Maybe we can hear stories from the festival." Kiel spoke again. "Tails, message, elf." "Tails and a message," Rhys said. "Fine. What is the message? What is your sister's name, and where will I find her? Kiel is giving you the message, elf, Brian said with a touch of menace. Or perhaps he had a boggart leg stuck in his throat. I understand, Rhys said, but honestly he did not. After a moment, Kiel stood with a grunt and a cascade of pops and creaks that pinged through his oversized bones. Message, Kiel said, and raised a fist in the air. The giant's giant hand blotted out the sun and cast a shadow over Rhys, but he didn't move an inch. Kiel crossed his other arm across his chest and plucked a small scroll of dried leather from a moss-like fur that lined his armpit. He held up the scroll delicately, between his blood-caked finger and thumb, and dropped it into Rhys's open hands. Message. Tails. Roshin. Message, Rhys muttered with a nod, tucking the foul-smelling roll of leather into the cuff of his boot. Roshin. The scroll tingled with magic against his fingertips. Brian or perhaps Kiel apparently knew a shrinking spell. That made sense for any giant who ever planned to do business with someone Rhys's size. Unfortunately, the once enormous hide had been poorly cured. He supposed there were worse things than smelling of a giant's armpit. Combining that smell with half-rotten arbormander hide certainly meant you were headed into lethal territory. Few predators would feel compelled to pick up his trail on the way back to camp, that was for certain. Any who tried would probably go blind. Perhaps this Roshin would find him, following the invisible, pungent trail. Roshin? The elf cocked one horn in curiosity. Wait, are you telling me your sister is Roshin Meanderer? Brian nodded, and Kiel thumped the ground. She talks, Kiel said. All the time, Brian added. Won't be hard to find her. Just do this. He cupped a filthy paw around his elongated ear. Follow the sound of Roshin talking. I'll pass that on to the messenger, Rhys said dryly. Can you also tell me where to start? Roshin hasn't been seen around here in a very long time. Where am I supposed to find her? No, Brian said cheerfully. You just find her. Always works for us. Then how can you be sure I've repaid the favour? If I can't find her, I can't... You'll find her. Kiel said that you're delivering this message, so that means you are. Really? Rhys said with an arched eyebrow. Is that a threat, Brian? Or is Kiel some kind of ogre oracle? I don't know what you just said, but then elves are always too smart for their own good, Brian said. It's simple. Kiel said you're doing it, so you're doing it. He knows. Like you elves know the leaves are about to turn. He knows a lot, but he doesn't say as much as he knows. He did say that little elf would trigger that attack soon. Probably should have told you about that, I suppose, but we were getting so bored. What? Rhys said, but forced his temper to remain in check. Even if Brian had informed him of Kiel's prediction, the then Dane would have laughed it off as madness. Brian soldiered on, ignoring the elf. He also predicted I would be wearing a hill hat. I know you didn't miss that, beauty. And he said you'd go back to your big boss in shame. If he knew all that, Rhys said, unable to contain himself any further but unwilling to get into an argument with the giants. Such arguments turned violent quickly, and Rhys was far too pragmatic to think he had a chance against two giants. Bog it all, he finished. He just could have mentioned something sooner, Rhys said. Oh no, Brian said earnestly. He's good that way. The best thing about Kiel knowing stuff is that he doesn't go around crowing about it. Brian thumped his brother, and Kiel issued another unintelligible grunt. We'll be around Kinsbale, elf. You go do us this favour and we'll be even. With that, Brian placed a calloused hand on his brother's shoulder and steered Kiel in the right direction. And then the two lumbered off to the road that ran along the riverbank all the way to Kinsbale. Rhys's path led in the opposite direction, around the smouldering remains of the twice-stained battlefield. Nath must have ordered his pack to put the clearing to the torch on their way back to camp, and the whole area was becoming a blackened swath of charred bone and smoking earth. Rhys went on, walking along an oft-used game trail into a typical stand of silverwood pines. and up an unmarked path through a canopy of forest to a temporary shelter that housed the Taercenn of the Gilt Leaf and his staff. On top of his failure and dismissal, twin dishonours he could hardly conceive, but which had already happened, Rhys was going to be late. Negotiating with the giants had taken far too long. Late and smelling of... He reached for the scroll in the back of his belt, intending to discard it, but something stopped him. Roisin Meandra was said to have foreknowledge, and if Brian and Kiel were her brothers, maybe it ran in the family. Kiel's talent might be legitimate. Kolfanor regularly made predictions that came true. They were always cryptic and opaque until it was too late for them to do any good, but they were accurate predictions nonetheless. Rhys squared his shoulders, avoiding eye contact with the last few straggling elves walking through the bloody bodies. They ignored him in return as they mechanically marched through the woods, swords drawn, ready to finish any boggarts that had survived the poison and the giants. They wouldn't find any, Rhys expected, but the formality was necessary, as was the far more painful formality of whatever punishment Taercenn Nath had in store for him.